we live in a day where if you can say things in a spicy way, you can get an ear, and then keep leveraging that so it looks like you have something really important to say. But the proof of having something important to say is actually in saying something important. Mm-hmm. And the importance isn't its timeliness alone. It actually has to be true.
Greetings. Welcome back to this episode of Theologically Driven. Today, I'm joined by Dr. David Doran. Dr. Doran, thanks for joining me.
Good to be here.
We're going to be talking about the idea of celebrity pastors, and this is, sure, lots of people have heard that phrase before. It gets thrown around a lot. Maybe you could help kind of explain to us, what does that mean, and maybe what's the debate around it?
Right. Well, I think part of it is the idea of celebrity is a fairly new development in the sense of I think it's taken all of its energy from mass communication. I mean, clearly someone could say, well, being famous is being a celebrity, but I don't think that actually follows. I mean, historically, someone became well-known or well-recognized or famous didn't necessarily meant that they were out in public much. It just meant that they had influence or a great reputation of some sort. But with celebrity, you can have someone really sort of have especially an ever-increasing kind of meteoric rise to name recognition that doesn't come from necessarily any contribution. It's, someone can amass a huge amount of followers and build a platform by simply doing controversial things or, happen to be in the right place at the right time to leverage their connection to some other person who's a influencer in our day. And so it used to be people gained a reputation. If it was positive, they became famous. If it was negative, they became infamous. But now, like the old line, there's no such thing as bad PR. I mean, people just many people are committed to simply making a name recognition kind of thing, to be in a position to be influential or to leverage it for some economic value. If you're talking secularly, right, a person's trying to become an influencer. The rise of pop culture, I think, is what's produced celebrity, so that you can have someone go from being an unknown actor to all of a sudden being an overnight sensation, or an unknown entertainer to all of a sudden having easily recognizable popular status in some sort. And so I think that's going to be an inevitability in the culture in which we live in now. I think the unfortunate thing is when it becomes a position of spiritual influence, so that you have, and sometimes we use the phrase celebrity pastors, and it's a little bit of an oxymoron because it's taking an office, pastor, and reducing it to some kind of influence, right? Because some guy on the other side of the country who has a large reputation is not actually my pastor. He's not your pastor. So he might be a celebrity preacher or might be a celebrity teacher of some sort, but the idea that he's actually shepherding somebody because he has name recognition is is not. It's a category that's I think dangerous. Certainly less than beneficial. I could at least say that. The difference. Well, I think that's the main distinction. It's someone who has a hard, like a well-earned, if I could put it that way, regard and recognition and respect because of longevity of faithfulness. They simply have been doing what is right, and God has expanded their influence. Is different than the kind of Jonah's gourd thing that grows up overnight and might wither just as fast because it wasn't built on steady, faithful service to Christ. It was someone actually made the viral moment somehow, and all of a sudden now they've got a big name, and they cash that in to keep increasing their influence. And the downside is it seems that the old axiom, what you win them is what you have to keep them with. You used to say that about church ministry. That's certainly true about this stuff. The guy who gets an audience because of controversial viral moments then has to keep that audience and expand that audience the same way.
Yeah. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit more about that. What are some of the dangers for the people who are elevating these guys? So thinking about that second category that you mentioned, the guys who just kind of sprout up overnight, they do get a large following and people really start to put stock into what they're teaching. What are some of the dangers there for people listening?
Well, there's loads of dangers. I think, and only the Lord knows all the details of it, right? But what I would say is, we at least have a biblical basis in 2 Timothy 4 for the idea that people heap to themselves teachers because they have itching ears. So a part of the dynamic that I think happens is that the crowd wants to go a certain way, and they find someone who's saying what they like. And so instead of the truth being the thing that establishes the groundwork, it's the desire of the hearer, right? So if you just take some of the faddish ones that have happened, right? So I'll just take like the masculinity stuff, right? I'm actually a big pro-masculinity guy, but the kind of secular push that all of a sudden you've got these very unbiblically wired secular views of masculinity that Christians should be opposed to, but they're gaining an ear because of the femininity of our culture. And the press toward feminization is getting a legitimate pushback. So all of a sudden you have people who are going, we need voices to stand up to this sissifying of the culture. And so they find someone who's saying what they want to hear. And then it becomes a massive puff of that person. So now it can become essentially an echo chamber that doesn't have the balance that it needs. Because if you disagree with it, you're immediately written off as being a part of the feminist kind of deals. Or, honestly, you look at like on X, the minute someone says something biblically reasonable, trying to push back against these abuses, you have all kinds of attacks and slurs and, I've had people, I pushed back on one guy one time and the very next, it was very short term. All of a sudden some guy's popping in and calling me gay. It's basically they're just They're just like a feeding frenzy that reinforces the worst kinds of dispositions. And so on the getting swept up into that is dangerous, because the tendency sometimes can be to ignore the obvious wrongs because they are partially right, and they have an opponent that is really wrong.
It's like we can live with this guy, even though there's some things we don't agree with, because he's attacking the thing we definitely don't like.
Right, and
So you
what it does
compromise.
is it justifies your own. This isn't probably the best way to say it, but your own barbarism. Right, these people are being rude, obnoxious. Their language is out of step with Scripture. But look at the influence they're having. Maybe it's okay. Maybe it's all right to speak like that, to act like that, because of how bad the enemy is. So you get this reinforcement of a really unhealthy thing that works. I mean, it doesn't really work, but it works longer in social media context than in real relationships. Because if that stuff's happening in the church, then the church is going to, when I say the church, local churches, then that's just going to rip the place to shreds, because there's no truth in love at that point. It's essentially, unless you're willing to say offensive things, you're somehow a wimp. And so that's just one avenue within. I mean, there's a whole, I just saw some stuff this morning about, this one guy who's, unfortunately very influential, and he's basically trafficking very close to anti-Semitic stuff, and there's this rise of this really bizarre kind of logic that so the people all of a sudden starting to think, well, I mean, hey, these are Christians, these are, these people are saying a lot of right things, and they're actually also saying these other things, and maybe there's more to it than I need to realize, and all of a sudden someone ends up going down the rabbit hole of these really misguided influences, because it doesn't take much to appear to be knowledgeable in a social media context. I mean, you can act like you've got a lot of stuff. I mean, that the same kind of thing is happening. It's happening in the secular realm, but Tucker Carlson interviews this guy who's supposedly this great expert on the history of World War II, and he says a bunch of really negative things about Winston Churchill, and then you get some guys who are really scholars, and they just shred this guy's statements, because this guy read a book, basically. He's not genuinely knowledgeable on the issue, yet he's given a puff position, and therefore he has out of balance influence. And I think that's the same thing happening on the celebrity pastor kind of a thing. So maybe this guy's got a big following online, so that seems like he's got some credibility, but it has no credit. I mean, maybe I'm too hard on this, but there's absolutely no credibility earned by the number of followers you have.
Mm-hmm. I've heard you say before that we seem to be wired that if we see something growing like that, lots of followers, we automatically equate that with, well, that must be God's blessing on it. And that's just not true.
Right.
At all.
Not God's blessing, and also not any really reference on are they knowledgeable. I mean, they, we live in a day where if you can say things in a spicy way, you can get an ear, and then keep leveraging that so it looks like you have something really important to say. But the proof of having something important to say is actually in saying something important. And the importance isn't its timeliness alone. It actually has to be true. And that's the side of it. I think you've seen it, and I think clearly there's nothing. I don't think there's anything sinful about leveraging the kinds of availability that social media stuff that's available. And we're sitting on a podcast, right? I think we don't. I don't think we want to make the mistake of thinking that anybody using any of these tools or devices is inherently pursuing celebrity. But it is a dicey proposition because all of us have to wrestle with the temptation, right? That could, because there's a process of rationalization that can happen. Well, like the larger my following, the more influence I can have for Christ. Sounds true, but it also can start to become, it can actually go from the means to the end. Right? So now the goal is to get a large following because we want to influence people. But what do we do to get that large following? How do we end up manipulating things because we want to get there, or being, it's a dicey game because if we begin to not say something that we ought to say because it could hurt our influence, or if we're saying things that we shouldn't say because it can increase our influence, we can start to fall prey to a kind of motivation that is very dangerous for someone who's, and now we shift back to the pastors, to someone whose primary responsibility is to be a steward of God's truth. And so our primary obligation is faithfulness to that. And if God opens up a door for us to influence 10 people or 10,000 people, that's up to God. But we're supposed to be faithful to that stewardship.
Yeah, and this is one of the dangers when men get elevated too early. They've not had the years of faithfulness, and that's why they get, people like their preaching or things like that, but they get a platform, and then it's almost like if their character's not developed enough or not ready to handle something like that, it's a huge temptation to just start chasing, well, that got a lot of clicks last time. That, that felt good. I'm going to do it again. And that's a huge danger and problem.
Right. And I think that I might probably beat this drum excessively, but I think if our ambition is larger than the local assembly, we inevitably start to put false temptations in the way. Right? So if someone's primary burden and heart is the flock that has been allotted to their charge by the Lord, and that's where their life is focused, and then God opens up other opportunities, that's a different ballgame than sort of being in that flock and thinking, how can I have a bigger voice? How can I influence and do this? And I think the tension there is that it's sometimes and you see this all the time. I mean, the person who's the one book wonder, or they have one super powerful message, right? And so that actually rockets them upward, and now the tank is empty, and they're running really risky because they're on fumes. and they have to just keep spinning stuff out. And at some point, it seems to me, over 4 decades, is that that's where a lot of guys end up getting caught at some point. Is they've outrun their reserves, and so then they have to have an opinion. They have to say something. They have to crank something out, and it starts to become thinner and thinner, and more dangerous, because they're not now running on the depth of what their personal study of the Word and ministry of the Word is. They're now, trying to chase the latest thing that they have to speak about, or they have to keep up the influence on. And I think that's the danger that you have. Whereas some of the guys that we might think are the most influential people are there and often have gotten there. We see it all now, but we forget the years, if not decades, of time that they spent before that was the case. Right? They were faithfully studying the Word, preaching the Word. They were really laying a foundation, and from that has emerged a great deal of influence, instead of the person who immediately hops into the circle where you can ride up fast, and at some point they're out too far. I mean, they're way over their skis, so to speak, and it's a dangerous thing. I just think the idea of celebrity, or being well known for being well known, pursuing it, name recognition, it's always it's a dangerous thing. Even if you're trying to make a name for yourself because you want to influence people toward more sound theology and ministry, I think that's an inherently corrupting way to look at it. Right? It should be, I would like to influence people for the truth of God, not I'm going to make a name for myself so that I can do that. And I think that our culture has opted for that pathway. Find a way to build your platform and influence, because the publishing houses, when they're wanting to know if they'll print your book, how big's your platform? And so there's just an enticement to that is it's not good. It's not good. And I think we've got an entire ministry industrial complex that thrives on it. Right? We build conferences by bringing in the highly visible, and we pump materials pretty much based on that, and it seems at times that ministries leverage their influence with one another by doing that, and I think I think when people look back on it, they're gonna see the shallowness of that, versus when we look back and we think of people who were extraordinarily influential during the window of time where God was using them, and they became well known and influential because of what God was doing. Right? They were doing the work, and God was amplifying it. They weren't pursuing amplification, and I think it might be hard sometimes to navigate the difference between those in a pop culture oriented world like we live in, but I think there is a difference in the heart.
Yeah, one pushback I've heard for not we shouldn't really care all that much about the celebrity idea is the church has always had celebrities. So thinking of like a George Whitfield or an Edwards or Spurgeon, who is pastoring a huge church. But if I'm hearing you correctly, there's nothing wrong with a sort of God-given, well-stewarded influence, like a Spurgeon, who seems to have, he was faithful to the end, seems to have, not really been trying to seek a name for himself, but he's just trying to faithfully pastor and steward what God had given him to steward. The danger is people who are sort of, trying to grapple after that. That's what we need to be aware of.
I mean, my guess is C.H. Spurgeon would have no concept of marketing like we have. And nobody was trademarking his name and building entire ecosystems of PR around him. It was simply in God's providence. He was ministering in a time where there was a lot happening for Christ. I mean, you figure it basically was a revival time in the 1850s. And he recognized that, and because of that, there were just multitudes coming to Christ, and the church was growing and growing, which then led to people wanting to hear, and so it was the byproduct of his commitment to the work at the church there. And I don't think that's the same as what we've got happening with the kind of like, and I know there's others that do this, but I mean, we went through the phase of, a pastor in one part of the country essentially opening up branches of their church in all around that area, but even across the country, because that guy's name would draw people to. So they're basically just a magnet so that people can come watch them on the screen. And you essentially are building it around a person and not around the body. And that's why some of these places, when they lose that person, they implode. And I think that's the telltale sign of it, that it hasn't been a healthy church. It's been a magnet around a magnetic personality, and that person has not fought against that. They've actually encouraged that. And they may be well-intentioned. I mean, only God knows their heart. They may be thinking, I'm just trying to leverage this to do the most for Christ that I possibly can. But being well-intentioned doesn't make something right. So what the fruit that will be evaluated is, what happens when the celebrity fades. I mean, when all of a sudden the tide turns in a different direction celebrity-wise, what goes on in that person's heart, and also what's the long-term solidity of that congregation. And I just think there's so many dangerous temptations in it. I mean, I think the best route, for somebody, it's just starting out in our kind of a day is it doesn't mean you have to avoid social media or any of those things, but it should be that you are not after influence. You're committed to the truth. So if there's something that you feel needs to be said, it's motivated by an issue of truth. It's not motivated by, oh, hey, this is a way to, start to build a following and get people, to recognize who I am. And I mean, and I think, the net result is, I think we can say celebrity, and it is true, and I think people are doing it. Part of the thing we should all recognize is that's we're the most any of the celebrity pastors are doing. I mean, maybe rare exception out there, but they're simply they're big fish in little ponds, right? I mean, you take take the top 40, podcasts in Christian circles, and they're probably not even a small fraction of Joe Rogan. And the reality of it is most people don't even know who our most famous preachers and pastors are. Right? If I walked around, Allen Park, Michigan, the suburbs of Detroit, I could probably drop the name, John Piper and John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul or whatever, and it's going to be just a small percentage of people that even recognize those names, let alone the people that we think are, the ones that you'll pack. I mean, if you put certain guys on the docket for a Christian conference, I mean, it'll be full of people that are there to hear that person. I mean, it's almost. I mean, 'cause I've been into conferences with some of those guys, and and it's like scary to me how much people will invest in a single person, and how much they will lock into this well-known person, and I just think it's not a net win for the health of the church.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen lines out the door waiting to meet a guy just to take a selfie or get him to sign the book for you.
Yeah.
It just seems like you mentioned it's not a win for the health of the church. I mean, you take people who are supposed to be involved in their local church, listening to hopefully the faithful preaching of the word, and they're going after these guys who have huge ministry influences. I wonder, what are some of those dangers for the church, the health? I'm thinking here, the health of the local church. How is this hurting that?
Well, I think if it's, anything that's leveraging outside spiritual influences against the influence of your pastors is not beneficial. You can have a certain kind of mindset that comes in when someone becomes the devotee of some famous influence, and then that person takes a position on something, and then the faithful shepherds of a congregation don't agree with that position, and now there's a conflict that develops in that way. And I mean, in some senses, it's inevitable. I think when we're talking the celebrity thing, though, it's people who you're hearing what they've said and not actually having a genuine sense of who they are and their leadership and function in it, right? I mean, you see this happen too often. Someone whose public persona doesn't actually match up to what's going on in terms of the integrity of their life. And often in those cases, there's a kind of dogmatism and an approach to teaching that makes it attractive to people. But it's because it's done without any, if I could put it this way, skin in the game. Right? I mean, they're not actually involved in the trenches of the local church and trying to work through the problem, and you could actually agree in principle, but then this person with no skin in the game declares their application to be the only possible application because they're not actually in it. They just have an opinion. And then you've got pastors trying to work through the complexities of circumstances and people, trying to shepherd people along. I mean, we saw that in the whole COVID thing. Every local church had to wrestle through its own particular issues because of the locale where they were. So what were the restrictions that were going on in their particular locale? What's the ramifications of the decisions they're going to be making? They had to work with the interior dynamics of their own congregation, which could have all kinds of differences to it, right? The age of the congregation, the nature of how healthy the church is, how long you've been in leadership in the church. I mean, there's just all kinds of dynamics that required shepherds to make careful, wise decisions. And then you've got some of these voices out there that have no skin in the game, who are telling people this is the way it ought to be done in every place and at all times. And it's like, what good is that? But then, and what they're not recognizing, sometimes they're recognizing. I mean, now you get it through the whole political season. I remember hearing guys say, if your pastor's not preaching on this, then you need to find a new church. Well, like, here's this guy on X saying that, who heads up a parachurch ministry. So he's got no problem dropping bombs into local churches. And what he does when he does that is actually draw a kind of following of people who are thinking that way. They're now reinforced in their divisive thinking, and he's reinforced in the number of followers that goes up. And none of it is being done in the best interest of Christ's body. It's being done actually to the detriment of it. And I just think that's the part of it that is the shame of what's happening is without, whether intentional or not, and I do think there are people who are intentionally doing it, and I think they will give an account to Jesus for building with wood, hay, and stubble. Because if 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 teach us anything, that adopting modes of ministry which are built on divisiveness are not going to pass the fire test. And the pastor who does what I just talked about in order to get people out of other churches into their church might see growth and they might seem successful, but someday it's going to go up in smoke. And if the Lord tarries long enough, in all probability that'll happen to them before they're done. Because if you build your church like that, someone else is going to come along who's more arrogant and pugnacious than you are, and they're going to draw people away from you. Because what you drew them with, you have to keep them with, which means you have to keep fighting. I remember years ago, there were 3 churches in this one particular area, not in Detroit area. But basically, I was talking to a friend about the history of those churches, and they were all, at that time, they were pastored by guys who were the generation ahead of me. And there were 3 influential churches, but as I started listening, I kept hearing about, like, well, people used to go to this church, now they go to that church. And I asked my friend about it, so, like, what's the story with all the stuff? He said, well, it basically would, every few years there'd be a migration because there'd be, one church, would do something and another church would say against it and draw people over to there. And then it wouldn't be long before the people that they drew over weren't happy with that. And, so you basically kept having this, this migration of unhappy people from church to church. And unfortunately, some of the pastors would welcome them in the door because, they come in, they're bringing resources, numbers, say, hey, yeah, we're the church for you because we take the same stand as you take on it. And then it wouldn't be long, and then there's another group out one side, and it's just a terrible way to go about shepherding. And now that's just taken on, what used to be sort of localized problem is now created a much broader field because of mass communications and media stuff. So, somebody 5 miles from us can be saying controversial things that are people in our church are picking up on, and all of a sudden they're going, yeah, that's right. And so that gets, that person gets their hooks into your congregation by leveraging something that you're trying to be careful to navigate. And it's a dangerous process.
Yeah, I can't remember what book it was, but I remember reading, I think it was from a Christian author. He was a pastor talking about money. And he said in a sermon one time, he said something about giving and being more generous. And then a couple weeks later, he had a couple in his church come up to him and say, hey, we listened to your sermon and we were planning to buy, we were going to upsize our house. We're going to buy a bigger house. And we decided to not do that, and we'd like to donate some of the money we were going to use for it. And he said, that was the first time I realized, what I'm preaching actually has influence. Right. People are looking for counsel and guidance. And guys who have a big platform, in some ways, are insulated from that. They can make a big announcement or application, but they don't have to sit with the people across the table and help them work through that. So I wonder about the guys who are trying to pastor faithfully in local churches. Two kind of concluding questions here. Number one, what have you done? You mentioned the dangers of some of these influences coming into the church, drawing sheep away, negatively influencing them. How have you guarded from that and helped to guard against that in the church where you pastor? And then maybe a concluding just word of encouragement for the guy who's trying to pastor, he's trying to be faithful, but it can seem discouraging sometimes because maybe the church isn't growing, maybe it's a small church, and you see these guys with huge audiences, and I can imagine you can be tempted to think, well, God isn't blessing my ministry because it's not numerically growing or whatever. Any words there?
Yeah, well, I think the long-term protection of the flock, you make the focus on the church and the word. Right. So if people are they committed to the congregation? That is, they're here not just for what they're getting, but that because they believe this is a gathering of Christ's sheep, and I have been gifted by God to participate in this assembly, and I'm coming to be a participant and servant, not just a spectator and a consumer of it. So people are thinking about the church as a body or a spiritual family rather than a dispenser of spiritual goods and services. And so, or a rallying point for my particular persuasion. Right? I'm here because I'm all mad about some issue, and they're all mad about the same issue too. Or even just I'm interested in this particular issue. So this is the church that always zeroes in on this issue, and that's what I want to hear. And I think what can end up happening is people don't recognize how much those outside influences might be shaping them to think that way. Right? Think about how niche-oriented all of the media things that we have these days, right? So if you want to, if you're a certain political persuasion, you tend to watch these news shows, right? Or you read these sites. So instead of it being a more broad offering of information, we've narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, and I think we have to recognize that process can start to affect the way someone comes to church too. I'm only looking for the things that have caught my interest right now, and so shepherding, a part of shepherding is helping people see that God sets the agenda, right? We worship Him, and we're doing so according to the fullness of His revelation of Himself in the Word, and the ministry of the Word is designed to give us a balanced balanced nutrition, not just the thing that we happen to want. And I'm committed to the assembly, so I'm not on like that statement about if your pastor didn't address this particular issue today, you should leave your church. And it's like, okay, not even, and because it's in bite size, it has that kind of lack of any kind of really pastoral wisdom in it. I mean, you at least would think you'd say something, hey, if your pastor never speaks about this issue from the scriptures, then there's something wrong. But it's like, if he didn't say something today, so now the agenda in every church has to match what this guy thinks is right, and he's feeding people that. And so if they're susceptible to that, then it marks an immaturity in them. They're being tossed about by every wind of doctrine and the cunning craftiness of deceitful men. So a part of shepherding is helping cultivate a stability in the congregation that is not susceptible to those kinds of winds. And so that's sort of the long haul of, hey, we're grounded in the truth and we're committed to one another as God's people. I'm not just going to walk away from my spiritual family because I didn't hear the sermon I wanted to hear today. I mean, that's like the restaurant that I used to love to attend changed its menu, so I'm going somewhere else. I mean, a church isn't a restaurant. It's not. It's an ungodly way to think about the Church of Jesus Christ. And so I think on that side, for the guy who's wrestling with that, I'm sure it's there, right? But I think we need to die to that. I mean, at the end of the day, the Lord is not going to value our ministry by how many people attended. And so why are we doing what we're doing? And if God places us in a place providentially that's going to be smaller, then I'm not saying you have to stay. You've got to have some sense of what you believe God wants you to do. But I don't think that part of it should be a significant part of our decision making. I think it should be. I have a responsibility entrusted to my care, and I need to steward this well. And if God wants to expand that, I'm going to trust Him with that. I need to be faithful with what I'm doing, and I think that I just think it shouldn't. So when John the Baptist's disciples came to him and basically were complaining because everybody is turning to Jesus, right? They're all going away. And John says two things. We always recognize the one, he must increase, I must decrease. But the one that he states before that, I think, is important. He says, that one's important too. But also important to remember this one. He says, a man can receive nothing except it be given him from above. So John understood that any influence that Jesus was having was at least under the control of God. So why would he be envious of that? Now I might look and go, and I have. I mean, there's times I've thought, like, why in the world is this guy being so influential? I mean, but I think if I mean, as much as I can know my heart, that my assessment of it all has been, I don't think that's going to be good for the church. Not, I should be able to do that, right? But if I did have that, like, why is that guy getting that kind of influence? I could do this better than him. Then I've got an ego issue, right? And I need to hear John, a man can receive nothing except to be given from above, right? So in God's providence, this person has that position of influence, and they've got that platform to say that. Who am I to argue with God? And now, if it's a person who's teaching heresy, then out of defense of God's flock, I may need to challenge the things that are being said. But if we're just talking about, and I'm going to put it in the air quotes, the success of a brother, why should that produce envy in me? I mean, I don't understand the way God works if I'm actually allowing envy into my heart about it. I should recognize that my responsibilities are right in front of me, and envy probably would reflect a distraction in my heart from what I am really supposed to be doing, right? I'm spending my time thinking about somebody else, and that must have some level of dissatisfaction in my heart with what God's given me to do. And so it ought to produce repentance in my heart. And so I think we need to be careful that we don't allow the culture to influence us in that way, because it may be we have something better to say than they have, but in God's providence, He wants us to say it to the people He's given us, and not sweat it. I mean, it's and I think the net result is I think it's sort of like common statement, right? But because I don't know who to attribute it to, right? You worry about the depth of your ministry, God will take care of the breadth of it. I think there's some wisdom there, right? As long as you're going, I'm going to go deep so that God will give me more. I think it would be, no, I'm accountable for the depth. So that's what I need to focus on. And if God chooses to expand that, then that's up to God. And I think we can pursue. Honestly, there is so much to do within the local church that I don't. I think we sometimes have to come to grips with I think the deception that's happened, that the real influence is in the universal church. And certainly God brings along the people who are like massively influential, and they're in His time, and they God provides them. But for most of us, the place that God is going to have us have the most influence is in the lives of the people that are in the pews of the congregations we shepherd, and we shouldn't underestimate the value of that, right? So, I've had some incredible opportunities to preach in large contexts. But it's like, you get that shot, and that's great, and God gives it to you. Praise the Lord, and be as faithful to the word as you possibly can. But a 45, 60-minute impress on a person, right? So let's say it's 5,000 people hear you, and you've got your 50-minute, 45-minute moment to make an impression on them. The reality of it is probably the number of people that it's going to be life-changing for them is going to be pretty small, right? It's gonna make a contribution, hopefully, but the the life-changing direction of it is going to be smaller numerically, probably, than the fact that you have the privilege of shepherding 70 to 100 people every week, week after week, and you're actually having a profound influence, not just on them, but on the generation that's coming from them. And actually, it's going to be a much deeper, longer impact. But this one looks sensational. It looks, we just live in a culture that's like thinking, I remember having a guy say to me one time, like, it was just bizarre because I was having somebody in to speak in one of our conferences, and they literally said, I could do a better job than those guys. And sort of saying I should be on that docket. And I'm just thinking, I pretty much guarantee you're never going to be on the docket, because if that's the way you think, and you think that strongly enough to be saying that out loud, you are clueless about the self-deception of your motivations. You want to be seen, and that's bad news.
That's good. That's wise counsel and very helpful. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. And thank you so much for listening to Theologically Driven. We're a podcast of Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. If you'd like to learn more about DBTS, you can just go to dbts.edu.